Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Janine and my goal is to share the joy of watercolor with you and show you some hacks to make painting easier. So for today's video I have something special. As I've been traveling, I have rediscovered some of my childhood art supplies at my parents'. When I started this video, I meant to simply compare them to the supplies I'm using today. But while filming, I actually found out that I used them incorrect or just used the wrong supplies altogether. In this video, I will show you some hacks on how to use them, as I'm sure a lot of you have similar supplies. I do not mean to talk ill about any particular brand of art supplies in this video, as they aren't bad, they are just very different from what I use today as an adult. This is why I refer to them as my childhood supplies. It is very fitting because it is what I started out with and it keeps it simple, as the supplies are made by many different brands. In elementary and high school, we mostly painted using, well, basically printer paper. I actually found one of the original paper pads stored away with some paintings. These large sheets are attached at the top and the bottom. Let's test my childhood paper against the cheapest watercolor paper I could find. Both papers are not cotton papers. I'm using my Winsor & Newton Codman watercolor for this test. Before diving into it, I would like to test some properties of the paper, as this will make painting easier and I will be able to plan my painting accordingly. My childhood paper is on the top, or the left side of this frame, and the cheap watercolor paper is at the bottom. The first thing I would like to test is the granulation. Some watercolor paints are granulating, which basically means that pigments tend to cluster together. There are several factors that can influence it. And in this test, I want to see how much each paper bulges, allowing gravity to influence granulation. You can also almost instantly see how the watercolor paper at the bottom has more structure to it, making it easier for pigments to sink into the creases. Next, let's try some blooms. For this test, I add watercolor to the paper and add a few drops of water into the drying paint. This will, or should, cause a really cool effect as the water is pushing the drying paint aside. I'm not worried about waiting for the perfect time to add the water drops, as I want to figure out if the paper bulges too much to create blooms in the first place. In this case, gravity would only move the water to the lowest point, creating a puddle on the paper instead of a beautiful bloom. Keep in mind that I cut out some drying time for the purpose of this video. The full effect will only be visible in the end result anyways, once everything is fully dry, but I can already tell that my childhood paper did not do too well. Let's test how the paper reacts to overworking. What I mean by overworking is how the paper reacts to it when I'm rough with it. I want to test how sturdy the paper is. If it is more fragile, it will break easier, and in the worst case, there might even be some holes in the paper. Since I'm using lower quality paper, I want to keep it fair, and I will be using a softer round brush. As you can see, some of the fibers of the paper came loose and formed little balls on the paper. This is a clear sign that the surface of the paper broke, and it will probably be visible once it's dry. The surface of the paper breaking is something that occasionally happens to me, especially when I'm using cheaper watercolor paper and sometimes when I'm using masking fluid, especially on larger areas, and even when I'm removing washi tape. As long as it happens to an unpainted area that is not supposed to be painted later, you can sometimes fix it. I made a whole video about that and I will link it in the top corner for you. The watercolor paper did a little better in this test, but I can still see some small balls of paper that formed. Let's hope that this is caused from me not washing the brush out enough. I'm excited to see the results once everything's dry. Now let's try the wet in wet method. How well this works depends, amongst other things, on how even the paper absorbs the water and how even it dries. In theory, the second color I drop in should spread out evenly. This test is similar to the blooms I tested, but here I'm using less water to avoid puddles. Using a second color will make it easy to see how even the paint did spread on the wet paper. The amount of blue watercolor I drop in varies. This depends on the dryness of the paper, but when you drop in a larger amount of pigment, it should spread further. This is an important test as it will tell me if there is a threshold amount of pigment I can safely add to create blooms and avoid puddles at the same time. Before we move on to the dry results, let's take a look at some footage I took with my cell phone. The biggest influence on the final results will have gravity. The paper buckles and waves or just swells up in the wet areas. This is moving the pigment around. If you use this type of paper, you need to learn to work with it instead of fighting it. You might, for example, use less water or work with more layers. Now let's take a look at the dry results. This test did confirm that watercolor does not really granulate when I use my childhood paper. Instead, it pools at the lowest point. In contrast, the cheap watercolor paper did do pretty well. As for the blooms, well, my childhood paper mostly allowed the water to pool and create one large bloom, as the water united to create one big large pool. The watercolor paper did swell up in the center, pushing the united pools of water to the edges. It also pushed the pigments to the sides, creating a border. So both papers kind of failed here. The green areas is where I was too rough with the paper, and it has surprisingly few damages. Both papers look surprisingly intact and sturdy. Both papers failed the wet in wet part of the test. The watercolor paper did slightly better as long as the drops are very small. Let me show you both papers from the side, just to give you an idea of how much both papers buckled. I think that this supports the point I made earlier. Gravity will move the watercolor for you, and you lose control over where the pigments end up. Different papers are better at handling getting wet, making it easier to paint. Once you know how your paper handles getting wet, you can work with it and plan accordingly. This might include making compromises. Just for fun, let's do 2 more tests. First, let's start to add a second layer of watercolor and see what happens. There are 3 properties I'm looking for, which might help me to assess how to use the paper. The first property is how translucent the pigment appears. Watercolor is a translucent medium, and even though I use the same watercolor for all my tests and my normal paintings, I can get different results depending on how the paper absorbs the water. The second property is how adding a second layer feels. The watercolor might not be absorbed as fast, allowing more time to work, possibly creating a more even distribution of the watercolor. This is what happens here with the watercolor paper. The third property I'm checking is how much the second layer causes the paper to bulge. The watercolor paper is fine here, but not the childhood paper. It buckled really bad and the watercolor pooled. The takeaway from it is that adding a second layer will cause a unique look, which I need to integrate in any painting. This is a test I would definitely recommend everyone who only has lower quality paper available. I learned just how much my childhood paper buckles and that the second layer leaves really uneven results. I also learned that if I use the cheaper watercolor paper, I should do an underpainting, as the second layer of watercolor goes on far smoother, almost like higher quality cotton paper. Lifting is something even some of the more expensive papers can't handle, as it can easily break the surface of the paper. Let's give it a try. I use an older moist brush. I then gently scrub with the brush over the paper to loosen the pigment. It can help to get a clean result when you soak up the loosened pigment with a paper towel while you still work on the spot. How well lifting works also largely depends on how deep the paper absorbs the pigments into the fibers. With the watercolor paper, I was able to get a decently clean edge where I lifted the pigment. I was also able to lift a lot of it, meaning that the pigment did more likely not get soaked up as deep into the fibers. Lifting was more difficult with the childhood paper. I was afraid of damaging the paper. The edge is also not as sharp as the edge on the watercolor paper. To confirm it, I did lift a sand spot on the childhood paper. If I had to guess the reason, I would say it looks like I simply could not lift as much pigment in fear of damaging the paper, leaving a smaller difference in color compared to the almost white paper I reclaimed with the watercolor paper. It is especially easy to see the difference when you look at them side by side. Adding soft highlights or even fixing spills will give you very different results depending on the paper you're using. This video is already longer than intended, but I hope you found it useful so far. In part 2, we will make 2 side-by-side paintings to test out what we discovered here. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.